Kevin Taylor, Principal of Taylor, Cullity, Lethlean. Welcome to Place Focus. Can you tell us what your favourite urban place is in Australia?
Well, in Australia, I was going to say my favourite urban space is actually the Bordeaux tram system, but that's in France.
Tell us about that. That's fine.
Yeah. It seems like a strange one because it's not an individual place, but Bordeaux inserted a new tram system into their city back in the early 2000s, so it was inserted into obviously a dense, older European city. But what's fantastic about it from an urban design perspective is that it does what I think urban design should do, and that is think at both the macro and the micro level. So at the macro level, they've changed all the streets, taken the cars out, put the tram system in, and not only that, but put interchanges on the edges of the city so people come in buses and cars and actually change mode, hop on the trams, and then the travel through the centre of the city is via the tram. So, big picture thinking about the whole transport system of the entire city. And then they've done an absolutely fantastic job of redesigning every street that the trams have gone down from building edge to building edge. Like in some cases, they've reduced main streets from 4 lanes, 2 lanes each way, to just a single lane in one direction, and put the tram system in other streets that would have been 1 lane each way. They've taken the cars out completely and just redesigned the whole street as a tram and pedestrian thoroughfare. So, the detail of the pavement, all the furniture design, the shelter designs, and of course the Bordeaux trams have got no overhead wires. It's just a central rail at ground level. So it's just beautiful to look at. The trams are highly articulated, very short sections before the articulation, so they turn the corners of the narrow streets of Bordeaux, the really sharp corners, and they just turn them. It's just like a snake winding through the streets. So that's probably the best piece of urban design I think I've seen anywhere, in my travels.
So if you think of Bordeaux, I guess, and other places, do they have consistent qualities? Do you think there's consistent qualities to places?
Well, I think the qualities that I think are really important, I think first of all is human scale. And in Bordeaux, that's one of the things they've done by taking the cars out. They've not only put the tram system through the streets, but they've pedestrianised spaces that were previously dominated by cars. So I think, for me, human scale is really important. I also think a sense of the space having been crafted to some extent, the materiality of it, the detailing, so that there's actually it's an extension of human scale, a sense of people being able to relate to the elements within the space as having been designed, made, cared for by another human being, which I think is really important. I think as an extension of both of those two, I think spaces have to be sociable in the sense that they promote human activity. They don't. They're not so anonymous. They're not so bland, hard-edged that they work against people socialising. I think that's really critical. And related to that, I think, is flexibility and sort of open programming, so that the space is not over-programmed, but that some effort goes into at least enough programming to be a catalyst to encourage people to be in the space in the first place. And I think in Australia, that's Federation Square is obviously the quintessential programmed space.
So by programming you mean sort of events and activities and ultimately festivals, I guess.
That's right, but I think not to the point where it's programmed to the point that it excludes people from actually there being any spontaneity and people using it as a social space. I think another one is obviously a sense of sustainability, a sense of through all parts of all aspects of design, materiality, the whole lot, a sense of caring about the long-term use of energy and resources. I think is pretty critical. And I think the other thing that we always try to do is to make or allow people's experience of a space to be multi-layered, to bring a sense of the site's own story. I mean, it's not, you could say just a sense of history, I suppose, but I think it's more than that. A sense of a sort of conceptual narrative that is perhaps not didactic in the sense of just, well, this is the history of the site, but perhaps being more open about the way that's expressed so that people can key into it in a number of different ways. So, I mean, they're the sorts of things that come to my mind when I think about qualities.
Do you have a definition of urban design?
Well, very loose. I guess my definition of urban design is more about the process and the outcome. I'd say urban design is the design of cities in a collaborative manner that produces an integrated outcome. And the key words there for me are collaboration and integration. I think urban design is not one discipline. Urban designers, I think, are crucial to the process of designing cities, but in the end, they're planning and design facilitators that bring a whole multitude of people together to actually make a city what it is. So that's the collaborative bit, and I think if the collaboration works, then you should get an integrated outcome, and I think that's the other key for me. I mean, you only got to look at cities all around the world, particularly Australian cities. What you see is lopsided outcomes. Either cars completely dominating, or in Canberra, I'd say in places like the Parliamentary Triangle and other places, landscape architects and open spaces dominated to the detriment of the sense of urban, the overall urban outcome. It's death by open space. So it's not just always the bad guys of the traffic planners. I think whenever it gets lopsided, and any one of the disciplines, whether it's architecture or landscape or some form of engineering, whether it becomes lopsided, then you get a result that just doesn't work on a whole range of levels.
Kevin, we're just starting to get used to the word urban design, and now we're talking about placemaking. Do you see a difference between urban design and placemaking?
No, I don't. I think it's the same thing. I think all the aspirations that people have when they talk about placemaking are the same aspirations that any good urban designer should have for the spaces that they're creating.
Kevin, you're trained as a landscape architect, and do you call yourself a landscape architect or an urban designer, or both?
Well, our company says that we work in the fields of landscape architecture and urban design. I would describe myself as a landscape architect and an urban designer. I've been practicing for 30 years, so I feel as though I've got enough experience to do that, and I also, although I've never practiced in architecture, I do have a degree in architecture, so I feel as though I do understand buildings. And through landscape architecture, I feel as though I understand the spaces in between them. And I think just over the years, I've worked on enough large projects to understand the more broader planning context within which we operate. And I really think you need to have an understanding of you need to have an understanding of a lot of things, I think, to be an urban designer, but I think you've got to understand how architecture works. At least in broad terms, you've got to understand how spaces between buildings work, and I think you've got to have some sort of understanding of the broader planning context. So I think that I do feel that urban design is one of those disciplines that people on the periphery of it do sometimes coerce or co-opt the name urban designer, and I think that's that's probably okay. It's an emerging discipline. There's not all that many people trained in it, and people need to communicate what their skills are. So yeah, I mean, I feel comfortable calling myself an urban designer after the kind of both the academic background that I've got, but also just the experience. Yeah.
What do landscape architects bring to urban design, do you think?
Well, I think they bring possibly the most crucial bit in all the skills needed, I think. But I think, landscape architects, both in their training and in their experience and their interests, vary enormously. I mean, some landscape architects are much more interested in what you might call the soft elements of landscape architecture, in broader scale planning and park design. But I think for landscape architects who are interested in the urban environment, I think they bring a crucial understanding of the spatial qualities of everything that's in between the buildings, which is absolutely crucial to the urban environment. And I also think landscape architects tend to just by instinct look to context for when they're designing something, which architects don't always do. And I also think landscape architects, and again, depending on where they've been trained and what their interest is, tend to have an interest in the broad scale landscape planning or urban planning. So I think that's absolutely crucial, I think, to understanding urban design and city design.
So I guess a common question maybe for clients in particular is who should take a lead on urban design projects? Is it an architect, is it a landscape architect, or a planner, or an engineer?
Well, I think it depends on the skills of the individual people involved, but I think it'd seldom be an engineer. And I think, personally, I think architects and landscape architects are best placed. I mean, increasingly there's people who are qualified in urban design, and if they're there and they've done a good course and got experience, then I think they'd be the obvious people. But I think architects and landscape architects, and I think of those two, I think landscape architects are best placed. But again, it depends on how much they've had an interest in the urban environment as part of their landscape architectural experience.
Does it depend on the project as well, do you think? What type of urban design project it might be?
Well, I think it does. It depends on, it probably depends on scale and the architectural content of the exercise that's being looked at. But again, I think landscape architects, because they tend to think in broader context, and so long as they've got a reasonable understanding of architecture and the broader planning principles, I still think they're well placed. Yeah.
Kevin, the award-winning North Terrace in Adelaide, which your firm designed.
Yep.
What's your favourite part of North Terrace, do you think?
I don't think I have a definite place, but the frontages of the museum and the art gallery and the library, not necessarily the forecourts, but the actual the part of the public realm out on North Terrace across those frontages, I think works really well. Partly because those frontages are really active. There's a lot of people coming and going from the art gallery, the library, the museum. The library and the museum have got forecourts that are adjacent, so there's a sort of the space expands. The more traditional streetscape public realm expands into those forecourts. And there's normally a lot of activity through there, a lot of people coming and going. The sculptural water feature that Hossein and Angela Valamanesh did in front of the museum forecourt is a really beautiful piece. There's some really beautiful existing trees that we're able to integrate into the design, some jacarandas across there as well that, from day one meant that there was shade there and it just had a really beautiful feel to it. Yeah.
Your design, I guess, or the outcome for North Terrace, is that a place that people move through, or could it become a destination, do you think, in some ways?
Well, I think part of the success of it has been the fact that it was designed to do both, and I think there's been a reasonable level of success there. It's very much a move through space for people moving east-west along North Terrace. Part of the brief was also to encourage people to move from the city down into the cultural institutions, and even to encourage them to move between the institutions down to the river. So there's people moving north-south and east-west. So it's definitely a moving through space, and I think that's the inner and outer path, with the outer path on the footpath where people tend to walk fairly quickly if they're catching a bus or something like that, and the inner path where they can more meander along the edge of the institutional buildings. I think that has worked pretty well. But yeah, look, I think people also see it as a place. There's a lot of, as the trees grow, it'll increasingly have a really strong sense of identity. But I think it already has. I think people already go to those institutions, hang about out the front, use the forecourts. I think Adelaide City Council could, there's some programming opportunities which I don't think they've really, capitalised on as much as they could have, that would utilise the spaces and make them even more of a destination for people. But no, I think it works as both at the moment, and it's good.
Someone was saying to me that it is designed to, there's PowerPoints and there's power there for cafes. And
yeah, there is.
That's what you're talking about, perhaps?
Yeah, well, look, there was a cafe proposed out in front of the museum building, which was taken out at the last minute. But yeah, look, the facilities are there. There are service kiosks built into the seating plinths along there. It gets used at festival times, but I think there's plenty of opportunity for it to be more used.
You kind of get the sense that if you were in a European city, it would be full of people selling coffee and
exactly,
which is obviously what you had in mind for that space when you were designing.
Yeah, well, I think this is one of the challenges of Australian cities, is that we don't use public space quite well, maybe with the exception of Melbourne. We don't use public space quite the way they do in some other parts of the world, and a lot of that's to do with density and people actually living in the inner cities themselves.
And
this
the space as well.
Well, yeah, probably. But look, Adelaide's, it's getting there. The actual population in the city, in apartments, etc., is growing all the time. There's the critical mass of people to use these sorts of spaces is building. When we first designed North Terrace, there was some real concern among various people in Adelaide that the spaces were too big, too much paving, too open. I think all that's been proved to be, even with the sort of moderate levels of population that we've got in the city, all the spaces have been really well used. But there's certainly plenty of room for them to be even more used if they're programmed. Yeah.
You talked earlier about incorporating sustainability into your projects. What are some of the sustainability outcomes with North Terrace?
Well, I think the big one is one that doesn't get talked about a lot in terms of sustainability, and it's to do with a phrase that was pretty popular back in the 1970s when sustainability was talked about, was the idea of long life, loose fit. The materials that have been selected for North Terrace are going to be there for a very long time. All the pavement is granite. In fact, it's local granite from South Australia, or it's local slate, Mintaro slate, or it's concrete or recycled timber. And particularly, it's the granite, I suppose, that I think really is the material that's going to be there for an awfully long time. And so I think the idea of just the long life and the selection of the materials so that it actually doesn't need to be replaced in 20 years' time, that it can last, or that granite pavement could last 100 years, 150 years. In fact, Adelaide City Council did an analysis when we were designing North Terrace back in around 2001. They actually did an analysis, and they were looking more at cost they did a life cycle cost of all the pavement options for North Terrace, and it went from bitumen to granite, and it went through in situ concrete, precast concrete, you name it. It was a huge matrix, and the granite actually came out in the top 2 or 3, simply because when you looked at a life of 70, 80 years and the non-replacement of that material against needing to put in maybe replace precast concrete 2 or 3 times in that period, etc. From a cost point of view, even though it was a very significant capital cost, they could see the life cycle cost as being equal. And the same goes for energy and resources that goes into that replacement. So that'd be the big one. There's some water sensitive urban design initiatives there, particularly in the museum forecourt, that's taking water from the street in North Terrace, also taking water off of the roofs of all the museum buildings, putting it through a biofiltration system. Goes underneath into an underground tank under the lawn area there, and it's used for irrigation. And that was the first time a system like that had been installed in Adelaide. It's been a challenge for the museum to look after it, because it was a new thing for them to look after. But basically, it's been pretty instrumental in bringing some of that thinking into people's minds as being something that can happen in the centre of the city in Adelaide. There are examples in eastern states, but there weren't examples in Adelaide of that at the time.
Those kind of features are, I guess, in some ways are quite fundamental, but almost discreet, aren't they? I mean, do you think we could be a bit more overt with the sustainability side of things, or is it more just part of the outcome?
Well, it's completely, that system is completely integrated into the design of the museum forecourt. It wasn't not an add-on at all, and quite, completely integrated. Look, I think the design for North Terrace was done back in 2001, 2002. The whole field of water-sensitive urban design has moved on pretty considerably since then, and certainly in the subsequent stages, looking at much more thorough use of that sort of technology. I think in terms of, as I said before, in terms of material selection, we probably can't do too much better than what we've done there. All the timber on all the seats is all recycled timber, and there's a considerable amount of that. And again, it's a really long-wearing timber that's not going to need to be replaced. So, I think certainly more could be done with the lighting side of it. And again, the technology's changed enormously with the introduction of LED lighting. You could probably light North Terrace now for 1/10 of the electricity supply that you'd light it with the conventional lights that are there at the moment. So, the technology is changing pretty significantly in some of those areas. So, I guess North Terrace is lucky in some ways in that it's a staged project, and new technologies can certainly be integrated into the stages as they evolve.
Looking back, I guess, over the last 9 years, is there anything that you might have done differently overall on North Terrace?
Well, it's one of those rare projects where there's not a lot. Most projects you do look back and think, gee, I would have liked to have done this or that. But it is a bit of a rarity, but there's not that much, I reckon. Putting the filter on that question of what you know is possible and what's not possible in terms of the context of the project, I honestly don't think there's all that much that would, and I certainly can't think of any big items. That project had a pretty fantastic run in the sense that the political context within which it occurred and the bureaucratic context within which it occurred was extremely supportive of a good quality result. Yeah. So there were very few compromises. Every project's got compromises as you go along, but there were very few, if any, compromises that resulted in, at the end of the project, us thinking, well, we wish we hadn't had to do it this way, we wish we could have done it this other way. This wasn't the case in that project.
It seems like a key quality for success, doesn't it? The role of the client, it's almost understated in some ways on many projects.
Well, that's more the case in Adelaide than it is in other places. In Adelaide, big urban design projects need both state government and Adelaide City Council cooperation for them to occur, simply because of the cost. Whereas in places like Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, the councils are big enough to go ahead and just fully fund the project. So the way the client sets themselves up in relation to the project in Adelaide is actually absolutely fundamental to the success of the project. But yes, the North Terrace project had a brief that put quality and functionality on equal par, and it was backed up by a committee system and a directorate that was set up specifically for the project, which was funded by both Adelaide City Council and the state government, and they really carried forward the objectives of the brief all the way through.
Was there a project champion, do you think, for the project?
Well, again, it was an unusual one in that there were probably 2 or 3 people at the time who were champions of the project, and some of those people were at quite high levels, ministers of government. I mean, we used to present to the Premier, and we used to present to a committee called the Capital City Committee, which still exists, but at that point in time it was quite powerful, and the Lord Mayor, the Premier, and 2 or 3 ministers of government were all on that committee, and we would present to them. So that was, that was the level of interest in the project and the level of commitment to the project, which is fairly unusual.
I guess just going back to looking in hindsight on North Terrace, how do project reviews fit into your firm's process of design? Are you able to kind of go back and test the success of these projects?
Well, I'd say it's more informal than formal. When you do a project like North Terrace in a city that you live and work in, your review process is pretty much continuous, because I'd walk down North Terrace at least twice a week, just going to and from meetings in the city. So we may not have filled out a quality assurance form that formally reviews North Terrace, but we've certainly taken an ongoing interest in what's going on there. We've just set up a research arm of our company called Tickle, and one of the things that Tickle is going to be looking at is actually putting in place exactly this sort of what tends to often be the missing link in the flow of information in companies like ours, where you do review your projects informally, but we're looking at ways of doing that formally through this research arm.
Because there seems to be an opportunity to kind of establish an aspiration up front with the project and identify some indicators that how you're actually going to measure your success, with the stakeholders and with the client up front, and then almost, ideally at the end of the project, actually, well, how do we stack up? How do we measure up against those indicators?
Yeah.
Your firm investigates contemporary urban life and global culture. Can you tell us what that means?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we're really conscious of is that the environment we're designing in is not a static environment, that technology is changing, the way people socialise is changing. People don't organise where they're going to meet a week beforehand anymore. Groups of kids communicate via text messages and mobile phones and decide in a flash that they're going to meet somewhere, and half an hour later they're meeting there. So we're just very conscious that as I said, the way people relate to urban spaces, the way they operate in them is changing, and we need to be aware of that. I think the whole issue of globalisation versus the local and the local sense of community is really again, really important, and some of that's to do with flow of information and technology. And I think the other thing is, at a really fundamental level, is to do with ownership of public spaces. You know, there's been big changes in the last few decades in relation to who actually makes urban spaces now, and you know, urban spaces are now quite commonly made by the private sector, and some of those urban spaces are more or less privatised in the way that they're operated and experienced. So I think there's a whole range of factors out there, some of which are cultural, some of which are to do with the way spaces are procured, some of which are to do with technology, that have just made us realise that, you know, you can't just, you know, go back to Lynch or other people's ideas about how urban spaces are used from the 50s and 60s and 70s, even though there's a lot of really fundamental truths in that work that you need to take, you know, really take notice of. But there's a whole lot of other contemporary things that are happening that are really influencing the way people use urban space, and you know, we see it as really important to just be aware of that and seek to understand how it influences how we might design the spaces.
Do you try and engage with existing and future users of your places to get a sense of what their needs and aspirations might be?
Yep. I mean, that's certainly something that we aspire to do in all our projects. How much you can do it depends totally on the project. We've just been involved in doing the master plan for Victoria Square here in Adelaide. So the way that we've engaged with first of all, the question on a place like Victoria Square, and in fact North Terrace is the same, is who is the community of interest? In Victoria Square, the answer to that is probably at least 1 million people. Everyone in Adelaide knows Victoria Square, would have an opinion about it, would feel as though they're a legitimate user of it, even if they've only ever been there once in their life, just because of the symbolic nature of the space. And North Terrace was in a similar category. So when you're working on spaces like that, the question is, how the hell do you engage with people? I mean, on Victoria Square, one of the things that was done with council was council actually engaged a professional market research company and did a statistically valid market research exercise with people who use the square, people who don't use the square. They did a series of focus group. I mean, this all is sort of going well beyond the normal community consultation that a designer would do. But in that case, because the users are potentially everyone in the city, you know, it seemed like an appropriate way to go. I mean, down at the next level, there's all the stakeholders, in projects like North Terrace and Victoria Square. You know, there's literally hundreds of people who own businesses around these places, government institutions, etc. So
public transport operators.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. So I mean, on those sorts of projects, we've been engaged in. I mean, on Victoria Square, it literally was hundreds of meetings with. I mean, I had some weeks where I had 20 and 30 meetings in my diary, meeting all these people, and you know, it's a lot of work to do. But in the end, it really has paid off, because everyone has. First of all, we understand what the needs. You know, like even meeting with the local hairdresser down there, who's got a hairdressing shop on Victoria Square. You know, we at least understand what their needs are, and probably just as importantly, is they all feel as though they've been heard. And
they're also a conduit too, aren't they? I mean, people complaining to them about different things. And that seems to be the way we're heading. We're focusing as much now on the user as the community, because they're quite different, aren't they? I mean, in some projects, the community might not even use a place that you're designing, so it's the user. And that's I think that's a nice opportunity that you're saying with the market research, is that we're not just asking the people that are using it, but we're asking people that aren't using it. You know?
Well, they deliberately sought out both people who currently use it and people who don't use it, because the key question they wanted to ask people who don't use it is, why don't you use it? And that was, in some ways, that was just as informative as the information from the people who use it. I mean, the other thing that is increasingly being used on projects, which is more at the consultation later on as the project progresses, is just the use of websites. Adelaide City Council developed a project-specific website, which was extremely good website. It had it just had every piece of information that was available on the project, literally. Even the detailed, 150-page report was there as a PDF document. Somebody could download that and read every word of it if they wanted to. Just a very open, and nobody could have criticised Adelaide City Council for not being open about that project. I mean, everyone who had a computer or access to a computer literally had access to almost every piece of information about the project.
And we're starting to get good at interaction too, aren't they? It's not just necessarily one way.
Well, exactly. I mean, they didn't set up a blog site, but people were able to register their comments on the website. But again, on some urban design projects, and again this happened on both North Terrace and more recently on Victoria Squares, the local newspaper, the Advertiser, literally set up its own blog on Victoria Square. So there was this whole other stream of consultation going on that went on for weeks in parallel with the formal consultation process that the council was managing.
So projects like North Terrace and Victoria Square, do you have a consistent overall process that you take to these type of projects, do you think?
Well, yes and no. I think that in some ways what I'm about to say is probably pretty standard for people. I mean, we engage in a lot of analysis of site and context, and usually go way beyond the site in sort of our starting point of looking at it, in looking at its urban context within the city that we're involved with. And also delving back, and again, it's not just history, it's more, it's the formal history, but also just the stories about the site.
The society, isn't it?
That we take a lot of time to look at, because one of the things that I suppose our company's probably known for is that we often have a very strong narrative or sort of conceptual underpinning of the actual physical solution that is the outcome, and that can only come about if you've done research about the place, and I guess what we strive to do is have a narrative or a conceptual underpinning that, as I said before, is not sort of overtly didactic, but is more multi-layered, but is underpinned in some reality about the site, so that when people key into it, it is specific to that place. So there's a fair bit of research involved in that, and also just the consultation. We do put a lot of effort into the consultation process, and as I said before, that varies on different projects as to whether you what's possible and what's appropriate. But we see it as really pretty fundamental to coming to the right answer.
Can you think of any broad outcomes of good urban design? How would you sell good urban design to someone that didn't really know what it was all about?
Well, I think I've probably mentioned all the things that I think are important. I think integration is the absolute critical one. To me, that just stands out as being so important that if you don't get that right, you're more than likely not going to have the right answer. And I think where people are heading with the idea of placemaking, which is not new. I mean, people have been talking about placemaking for a couple of decades, but this whole idea of how do you turn a space into a place, and a place is a space where that has meaning for people, essentially, and so I think integration, meaning for people, and human scale and a sense of sociability, I think the sort of key things for me.
You've got extensive experience in the private sector. What advice would you give to people starting out as urban designers?
Well, I think tenacity is really important. Tenacity and a sense of longevity. We've got projects that we've been working on for over a decade. You know, North Terrace in Adelaide is one. We started work on that in 1999 with an urban design framework. We've now done 3 stages. The state government is saying they want to complete it by 2016 when they open the new hospital down the western end. If it does run to 2016, we will have been working on that project for 17 years. And you know, ministers, premiers, lord mayors, councillors and all the people in the bureaucracies have all come and gone. And as urban design consultants, we're really the only people left standing. Well, we're 11 years into it and we're already the only people left standing. There is nobody left on that project in any state government or department or in the council who was there when we started that project. So tenacity to keep going with projects that require a long-term commitment, and making that long-term commitment I think is really, really crucial. Which I think is different from a lot of architectural projects and other landscape architectural projects that don't have that long period of time for them to be implemented. I think collaboration, you know, the ability to and desire to collaborate not just with other disciplines, but I think in urban design, again, perhaps more than other areas of landscape architecture and architecture, you've got to be able to collaborate with the client. The client is often multifaceted. You've got to be able to, you know, almost become part of the client's team. I mean, there's a lot of talk in project procurement in recent years about partnerships and that way of working, and I think in urban design, you know, very frequently you've got to work that way to get things over the line. And I just think an unwavering commitment to quality. Every design discipline is plagued by, you know, death by 1,000 cuts of you know, the original desire and integrity and vision being, you know, just gradually eaten away. And I think in urban design, because it's so multifaceted and there's so many components of it, it's very easy for that to happen. So, and that's partly what I mean by tenacity. I think you've got to be really tenacious about quality, I think.
What does the future hold, do you think, for urban design? Challenges and opportunities, I suppose.
Well, I think urban design is where the future is, really, in design. You only got to look at what's happening around the world. People on every continent are streaming from the country to the city. If we're going to manage the social, cultural, environmental impacts and opportunities of human beings on the planet, then we're going to have to design, you know, learn how to design cities that meet all those needs. And we're going to have to learn how to retrofit existing cities. I mean, peak oil, you know, even forgetting climate change, but just even the concept of peak oil is just a huge issue for, you know, almost every city in the world that's been designed around the motor car. So both the design of new cities and the redevelopment of existing cities to cope with the new population and to cope with all the environmental imperatives and to give people a, you know, not just an acceptable but, you know, a real quality of life. Urban design, I think, is just absolutely crucial. You know, so it's both a challenge. I mean, a challenge to, you know, respond to that is huge, but it's also just a huge opportunity, I think.
Kevin, thanks for your time.
That's okay. Thank you.